My name is Shireen Daniels and I'm the founder and managing director of HR Rewired. Now, we're a HR consultancy that specialises in anti-racism. In fact, I myself am an advocate for anti-racism in business. My story is an unusual one. However, it landed me a feature in Forbes, and I've also been recognised as a LinkedIn top voice for talking about racism. Day in and day out, I specialise in one of the most emotive and divisive conversations known to society. Conversations about race, racism, privilege, white supremacy are enough to make anybody recoil. But what we're seeing on the back of the global protests of 2020, with the death of George Floyd and the raising awareness that this problem that we've kept silent about, assuming that we lived in a post-racial world where skin colour didn't matter, is actually a fallacy. What we're recognising is the conversations of last year, they haven't gone away. Organisations are expected to do more. They're expected to not only have those conversations, but commit to sustainable and impactful actions. It is not enough to regurgitate some of the traditional diversity and inclusion approaches, and instead there is a spotlight on racism. There is a spotlight on racial equity within the workplace. So for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through how you get started with your anti-racism journey. But I'm going to do that by also sharing some of my experiences and also context in how I got here. Now, I exist to push people out of their comfort zone, to take them out of this illusion that silence is safety. Now, the reason why I can talk about this is because I too found myself sitting in that comfort zone of silence, thinking it was safe. In fact, for 17 years, I never spoke about how racism impacted me. I never spoke about how it felt to be the only different person in majority white spaces. I never spoke about how I felt having to assimilate, and I never spoke about what it meant to sit on boards where I knew I'd be the only one. You know, when the protests happened last year, I found myself in this space of listening to professional conversations saying, thank goodness that's happening in the US and we don't have that problem here in the UK. And as those conversations ramped up, I found myself getting more and more frustrated. But it's fundamentally because I care. And the organisations I work with also care. They might not have the answers about what they need to do. They might not feel comfortable about having this level of conversation, but they're committed to being part of the solution. They just want to know how. So firstly, most of us are problem fixers. In HR, we like to fix problems. We're resourceful, we're mostly good under pressure, and when there's an issue within the business, we're the first to jump in to give answers, options, perspectives, solutions. But to get started in anti-racism and to think about how you start to address some of the racial inequities within your organisation means you have to listen. And you have to really identify what the problem is, and to do that means you have to dig deeper and understand what is racism. The piece that I'm most concerned with is less about who's called me the N-word, and it's more about what are the systems, the processes, the policies, the expectations, the value systems, the beliefs that contribute to a society which manifests itself in the workplace, where Black people are seen as inferior, where Black people are seen as the bottom of the rung of the ladder, and where we accept that whiteness is great. You know, so when I talk about whiteness as a construct, it's not about going, you white people do this or you white people do that. It's about understanding that we live within a racialized society that places white people at the top of the ladder. And that manifests itself when you step into organisations, and what do you see? Majority white leadership teams. You can step into an organisation who has a head office in London, which is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world. And you still step in and you see majority white workforce. And where you do see people who are minoritised, they are normally in frontline operations or they are in lower levels within the organisation. Now, some people might say, but that doesn't mean that we're racist. And what I say is you have to ask yourself the question, what is it about your organisational culture that works so well for people who look like you consistently over the last 400 years? And why it doesn't seem to work for people who look like me? So when I'm talking to executive leadership teams, I'm saying to them, you have to understand the problem before you can solve it, because if you don't, not only will you waste time, money, energy, and resource in the wrong places doing the wrong things that will make very little impact, you potentially might perpetuate more harm. Because what's that definition of insanity? If we keep doing what we've always done, how can we expect a better outcome? Anti-racism is a distinctive element on its own. It isn't diversity and inclusion. It is about eradicating everything that contributes to racism and also thinking about how you can level the playing field through practicing equity. I also say one of the things that you've got to get comfortable with is the fact that to do that well and to make the changes that you want to make, and when you start to understand what racism is and what it isn't, is you've got to prioritise Black people. And there are a lot of leadership teams who struggle with that. And then that's the bit that you have to get underneath and go, why is that an issue for us? Why are we okay to prioritise women and getting more women on boards? Why are we okay to prioritise this group? Why are we okay to prioritise that group over there? Now, there is something about Black people where we hide behind phrases like ethnic minorities or BAME, and we never say the word Black, speaks to a subconscious recognition that the post-racial society that we thought we lived in doesn't actually exist. So the next phase that you want to do is you want to start listening. Once you've had the deeper understanding about what racism is and what it isn't, you want to engage with the colleagues within your organisation. Now, even if you've done this because maybe you've had one-to-one conversations or you've held your own version of listening forums or town halls, and you've asked them to share their experiences. So what you've said to them is, we want to listen because potentially we haven't listened before. But you resharing of your trauma, the internalisation that you've done in terms of how you've been treated, whether it's in our organisation or other organisations, is not in vain. Everyone sometimes is really quick to jump to data, and we'll get to that bit. But firstly, you have to recognise that if you do have Black colleagues within your organisation, many of them may have felt silenced. They may have felt like they had no voice, and even when they did, nobody was listening. It's the examples of, I remember being in meetings and contributing with ideas and being completely ignored. But then somebody else who didn't look like me said exactly the same thing I did, and everybody thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm sat there thinking, but how did that happen? When it happens once, you can pass it off as an accident. But it's been a consistent theme within my corporate career. There's been a consistent theme of when I've started to talk about racism, I've been shut down. I've been asked as maybe, am I sure it's not my perception of this person or this situation? I've been assured that the individual or the client or the supplier is well-intentioned because, well, you've seen them hanging out with Black people, so they can't be racist. Or because of your discomfort, I can't have that conversation, so we shut down that conversation. The listening aspect of this is crucial, because what you're saying is, for the first time, is you're not proving to me that racism is a thing, because we've gone beyond that now. I'm asking you, not forcing you, to share your experiences to help me understand how it impacts you, how our organisational culture impacts you, so we can take this qualitative feedback and do something with it. Then when you've got the data, and the data is the hard stuff, so the data is what you're looking at in terms of new hires, you're looking at who gets promoted, when they get promoted, you're looking at who gets to go and do the glamour projects, who gets seconded, you're looking at pay data, ethnicity pay gap data. You're looking at who gets pay rises in cycle and out of cycle. Who's on the radar of the board? Who isn't on the radar of the board? When you look at your employee relations cases, how do you deal with elements of racial discrimination or any sort of discrimination? How often does it happen and what are the sanctions? All of this data will tell you a little bit of the story. Now, I'm not saying that where there are patterns in that data that don't look good, you jump automatically to say, well, it's about racism. That could be the root cause. But what you do want to engage with is what we well recognise as the 5 whys. So if you have a pattern in the data, if you have disparity in pay, for example, ask yourself the question why. And keep going and keep going and keep going. And when you do that exercise for all of the data points, you start to recognise the problem that you have within your organisation, and then you layer in some of the qualitative data that you got from the listening forums or the town halls or the one-to-one conversations. And that will paint a picture as to what is going on, for then you to make an informed decision about what you want to tackle and how. Now, the next stage is about how you create that framework. So you're pulling together all of this knowledge from internally within your organisation. You're layering it with what you now know racism to be versus your perception of what you thought it was. You've recognised what systemic racism is. You've recognised how society perpetuates some stereotypes, values, belief systems about what Black people are and what we aren't. And then you started to layer that with your organisational values. What do you stand for as a company? What are your growth ambitions? What new territories or markets are you trying to get into? What new products or services do you want to launch? And if you don't deal with this issue, how is that going to impact your ambitions? Because to some extent, I say the size and scale of your ambition, there is a correlation to how much work most leadership teams are willing to do in this space, even though it makes them feel uncomfortable. So yes, you want to take the traditional life cycle, the employee life cycle, and think about all the interventions and the policies and the behavioural changes and the raising awareness programs and all of those things. But you also want to consider your influence within your industry. How can you change your supply chain to make sure that a proportion of the contract work that you give out actually goes to Black-led businesses, because that's about equity? Have you thought about asking your suppliers or your partners, what are they doing in this space? Because that's how we can apply positive pressure to each other and it becomes a virtuous ecosystem. Now, at this point, what I say is, even if you don't quite believe whether it's the right thing to do, if you're still needing a business case to address this, you have to question whether your organisation is ready to do the change, is ready to implement the actions that need to be made that really make a difference. And when I talk to executive boards, one of the things I say is even the idea of making a business case to make your cultures less racist, more equitable, more kind, is actually a manifestation of white supremacy. Because it implies that only because there's value in pounds, shillings and pence, that we should look at making our organisations fairer, that we should look at hiring more Black people, because, well, if you hire in more Black people and they're really good, they can make you more money. So I'm not saying you can't talk about and think about lining up what you're trying to do here with where you're trying to get to, but your whole premise for doing this can't just be about making more money. So moving on to the last stage, as you're creating your framework, because you've got the knowledge of what racism is and what it isn't, you've listened, so you've got qualitative data, you've got quantitative data, you've thought about the framework and how you're going to influence your ecosystem as well as what's going on within your organisation. The last bit is you don't want to leave behind the rest of your workforce. Now, I've seen this time and time again that we set up anti-racism task force, or we set up affinity groups, employee network groups, and we put all our focus and spotlight onto them. But then everyone else is thinking, hang on, like, when do I get involved? Because I really want to get involved, but I don't know what to do. And it's recognising that many of your employees do want to be part of the solution. But if they don't understand the problem like you didn't understand the problem, if they haven't had the opportunity in some way, shape or form to understand how racism impacts on people who look like me, because they don't know people who look like me, overlooking them means you're missing those valuable champions, those allies who can help you get to where you want to be quicker. So yes, we have to concentrate some energy on the board. Yes, we have to concentrate some energy on HR, DEI leads, task forces, employee networks. But you also want to think about how do you enable the rest of your workforce to be what I call pioneers of change. Because the embedding of the initiatives, the programs, the behaviour changes, the value sets is done with those employees, not just with these different groups in isolation. So when you're thinking about racial equity, when you're thinking about anti-racism, when you're thinking about elevating your DEI efforts, always be thinking, how can we make sure that we equip all of our workforce with this knowledge? How can we raise their levels of consciousness in this space so they can understand what we're trying to do and why, so they feel inspired to be part of the solution and they don't feel like they're being left behind? Because I recognise that the hardest work to do in this space is for many people who worry about what people will think when they start really getting into this. What will their other white colleagues, other white managers, other white directors think? And then what if they say the wrong thing? I have so many CEOs who say to me, like, Shireen, I really want to do this, but like, I'm really worried about, what if I say this and I'm accused of being racist? But if I don't say anything and I'm accused of being racist? And the best advice I can give you is this. The way I've been able to be so outspoken publicly with my views, and what that also means is because people know what's in my heart and they know why I do this, when I trip up and make mistakes, it's publicly mostly. And I'm forgiven and I'm educated and I acknowledge and I do all these things in a public arena. But fundamentally, I keep going because it's my mission before myself. I've spent 17 years being worried about what other people will think about what I do and what I say, so I've stayed quiet. But for 17 years in corporate world and another 3 years almost out of it, people will do that anyway. So I have to stop living for trying to please white people and start living for me being to uphold my own values. So when I look in the mirror, I can be proud of what I'm doing every single day. And if we fast forward 10 or 15 years, I want to be able to look at my daughters and say, when this was going on, let me tell you what I did. And have like pages of bullet points. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it makes it easier if you can think beyond yourself. Think about the impact that you want to make for the colleagues who are in your organisation, or potentially the colleagues who haven't started yet, but you can attract them when they see what you're doing.